The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, cream-colored and weathered at the edges, as if it had traveled through decades rather than miles. Margaret Chen stood at her mailbox, the morning sun warming her silver hair, and stared at the handwriting she didn't recognize but somehow knew. Her hands trembled as she turned it over. No return address, just her name in elegant script that seemed to whisper secrets she'd forgotten how to hear. "Mom, what's that?" Margaret looked up to find her daughter, Susan, walking down the driveway with a bag of groceries. When had she arrived? Margaret couldn't quite remember. "Just a letter," Margaret said, tucking it into her cardigan pocket, though she didn't know why she wanted to hide it. "From who?" Susan's voice carried that careful tone Margaret had grown to recognize, the one that pretended everything was normal while watching for cracks in reality. "I don't know yet." Margaret smiled, the same smile she'd been giving her daughter for months now, the one that said, "I'm fine, don't worry, I'm still here." But the truth was, Margaret wasn't entirely sure who "here" referred to anymore. The doctors called it early-stage Alzheimer's. Margaret called it a thief that stole in broad daylight, taking words from her tongue, faces from her memory, and whole chunks of her life without asking permission. Inside her kitchen, a room she'd cooked in for 42 years, but sometimes forgot how to navigate, Margaret made tea she would probably forget to drink. Susan had already left, though Margaret couldn't recall saying goodbye. The envelope sat on the table between her and the steam rising from her cup, daring her to open it. With fingers that felt both young and ancient, she tore the seal. "My dearest Margaret, I wonder if you'll remember me. I wonder if you even remember that summer, the one that changed everything, the one we promised to never forget. But perhaps you have forgotten. Perhaps that's better. I've been reading the letters you wrote to me 58 years ago. Letters I kept in a box under my bed, tied with the blue ribbon you wore in your hair the day we met. In them, you promised you'd never forget me. You promised the memory of us would outlast everything. So I'm keeping your promise for you. I'm going to tell you our story, Margaret, letter by letter, memory by memory, and maybe, just maybe, you'll remember what we were. Do you recall the carousel? Let's start there. Forever yours, James. Margaret read the letter 3 times, then 4. Each time, the words rearranged themselves in her mind like puzzle pieces that almost fit but didn't quite lock into place. James. The name echoed in a hollow chamber of her memory, bouncing off walls she couldn't quite see. A carousel. She could almost hear music, the mechanical wheeze of an old calliope, children laughing. She closed her eyes, blue paint chipping on wooden horses, the smell of cotton candy and summer rain, strong hands lifting her onto a painted stallion with roses carved into its saddle. A laugh, her own but younger, fuller, wild with joy. Margaret gasped and opened her eyes. The memory vanished like smoke, leaving only the ache of its absence. She looked down at the letter again, but now the handwriting seemed to blur and shift. Had she already read this? Why was there a letter on her table? The fog rolled back in, gentle and relentless, and Margaret stood up to make tea, forgetting she'd already made a cup that sat cooling at her elbow. The second letter arrived on Friday. Margaret found it in her mailbox and opened it standing on her front porch, unable to wait, though she couldn't quite remember why this felt urgent. "My dearest Margaret, in your 3rd letter to me, written in August of 1967, you described the carousel in detail. You said the horse you chose had a green saddle and a golden bridle, and that you picked it because green was my favorite color. You said I laughed when you told me this because I'd never mentioned my favorite color. You just knew. You wrote, 'I can read you like the sky reads the ocean, James. Every shift in your mood is a tide I feel in my bones.' I kept that letter in my wallet for 30 years. The paper nearly dissolved from being touched so many times. The carousel was at Riverside Fair, do you remember? It was the last weekend before you left for college. We'd been together all summer, keeping it secret because your father had plans for you, plans that didn't include a dock worker's son. You wore a yellow dress that day. You said yellow was the color of bravery, and we were going to need it. We rode that carousel 7 times. On the 7th time, I asked you to marry me. You said yes. Do you remember what happened next? Forever yours, James. Margaret's legs gave out. She sat down hard on her porch steps, the letter fluttering in her shaking hands. Yellow dress, Riverside Fair. The memories crashed over her like a wave breaking against rocks, sharp, immediate, devastating. She was 18 again, spinning on a carousel, and the world was made of music and light, and a young man's eyes the color of rain. James. His name wasn't just an echo anymore, it was thunder. James, she whispered, and the word tasted like summer and salt and promises made in darkness. He'd asked her to marry him. She'd said yes, and then the memory slipped away before she could catch it, leaving her gasping on her porch with a letter from a stranger who knew her better than she knew herself. Susan found her there 20 minutes later. "Mom, what's wrong? Why are you crying?" Margaret looked up at her daughter, her beautiful, worried daughter who she loved fiercely even on the days she forgot her name and couldn't explain. "I received another letter," was all she could say. Susan read it, her expression shifting from concern to confusion to something harder. "Mom, who is James?" "I don't know," Margaret said. Then, "I knew him once. I loved him." "You loved Dad?" "Yes." Margaret nodded. "I loved your father very much." "And then who?" "I don't remember." The admission felt like falling. "But I need to." Susan looked at the letter again, then at her mother. "This might not be healthy, Mom. Someone is sending you letters about a past you don't remember. What if it's upsetting you? What if it's giving me back pieces of myself?" Margaret interrupted, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "What if someone loved me enough to try?" Susan was quiet for a long moment. Then she folded the letter carefully and handed it back. "I'm staying here tonight." Margaret didn't argue. She went inside and put the letter in a drawer in her nightstand, next to the first one. 2 letters. 2 pieces of a puzzle she was only beginning to understand she'd lost. That night she dreamed of a carousel and a boy with rain-colored eyes who promised her forever. And when she woke, she couldn't remember the dream, but felt its absence like a phantom limb. The 3rd letter came on Monday. Margaret was ready for it. She'd spent the weekend in a strange state of anticipation, checking the mailbox 3, 4, 5 times a day. Susan watched her with worried eyes, but said nothing. "My dearest Margaret, your father didn't take the news well. You wrote me about it in a letter dated September 4th, 1967. Your handwriting was shaky, the ink smudged in places where your tears had fallen. You said he'd called me unsuitable. You said he'd reminded you that you were going to Stanford, that you had a future that didn't include getting tied down to someone like me. You wrote, "He doesn't understand that you're not tying me down, James. You're the only thing that makes me feel like I can fly. But you were 18 and scared and about to leave everything you knew. And I was 19 with nothing to offer but dock worker wages and a heart that was completely, irreversibly yours. We met at the pier the night before you left. Do you remember? It was raining. You always loved the rain. Forever yours, James, the rain." Yes, she remembered the rain. Margaret closed her eyes and she was there, standing on a dock that smelled of fish and salt and creosote, the Pacific crashing against the pylons below, rain soaking through her clothes, and James, solid, real, holding her like she was the only thing keeping him anchored to the earth. "I'll wait for you," he'd said, his voice rough with emotion. 4 years, forever, however long it takes. "I'll write every week," she'd promised. "And when you come back, we'll get married," he'd finished. "Carousel and yellow dress and everything. They'd kissed in the rain, tasting tears and ocean spray, and the future they were both terrified of losing. "I love you, James Chen," she'd whispered. "I love you, Margaret Lee." The memory stopped there, sharp and sudden, like a film reel snapping. Margaret opened her eyes, gasping. Chen. James Chen. Her name was Margaret Chen. The pieces clicked into place with devastating clarity. She married him. Somehow, despite everything, she'd married James Chen. But if she married him, why didn't she remember? Why had Susan looked so confused when she'd asked about him? Why? The fog rolled in again, gentler this time, but no less final. Margaret looked down at the letter in her hands, confused about why she was holding it, why her face was wet with tears. She went to make tea, forgetting about the letter on the table, forgetting about the rain and the promises and the boy she'd loved enough to change her name for. Susan arrived that evening with dinner and found her mother staring out the kitchen window at nothing. "Mom, did you get another letter?" Margaret turned, her expression vacant. "Letter?" Susan's heart broke a little. She found the third letter on the table and read it, her hands trembling. James Chen. Her last name was Chen because her father, the man she'd known as Howard Chen, the quiet, steady man who'd raised her and loved her mother with patient devotion, had been James. But her mother had always called him Howard. Everyone had called him Howard. Susan pulled out her phone and scrolled through old photos, looking at her father with new eyes. Howard Chen, who died 6 years ago from a heart attack, who'd been devoted to Margaret for their entire 50-year marriage, who'd held her hand through the first terrible days after her diagnosis. He'd always called her Maggie, always, even when she'd asked him why. "It's what you told me to call you," he'd said once, "the first time we met. You said your name was Margaret, but I should call you Maggie." But that wasn't true. Susan had heard the story of how her parents met at a graduate school mixer in 1970, both getting their master's degrees at Berkeley. Her father had been studying engineering, her mother, literature. They'd married a year later. Susan looked at the letter again. September 4th, 1967, before graduate school, before Berkeley, before the story Susan had always known. She looked up at her mother, who was now making tea for the third time that evening, each cup forgotten as soon as it was made. "Mom," Susan said softly, "tell me about the carousel." Margaret looked up, her expression briefly clearing. "The carousel?" "Yes, the one at Riverside Fair." Margaret's face creased with concentration. "There was music, and a boy, James. He was—" She stopped, lost. "What happened after the rain, Mom, after the pier?" "I don't remember." Margaret's voice broke. "Why can't I remember?" Susan went to her mother and held her while she cried, and for the first time, Susan wasn't sure if her mother was crying because she couldn't remember, or because, for just a moment, she could. The fourth letter arrived on Thursday. Susan was there when Margaret opened it, and she read it over her mother's shoulder. "My dearest Margaret, you went to Stanford. I stayed in San Francisco and worked the docks and counted the days. You wrote me every week, just like you promised, sometimes twice a week. Your letters were full of classes and books and new ideas, but always, always, you ended them the same way. I love you. I'm coming home. Wait for me." I kept every letter, 68 of them from that first year alone. And then, in January of your sophomore year, the letters stopped. I waited. 1 week, 2, 3. Finally, I called your dorm. Your roommate answered. She said you'd gotten sick right before Christmas break. Some kind of infection. You'd been hospitalized for weeks. She said you were better now, but different. "She doesn't remember things," your roommate said. "She got really sick, and when she woke up, she couldn't remember the last year. The doctor said it might come back, but—" I took a bus to Stanford that day. 12 hours. I showed up at your dorm, unshowered, unshaven, desperate. You answered the door and looked at me like I was a stranger. Can I help you? You asked, polite and distant. Maggie, I said. It's me, it's James. You shook your head. I'm sorry, I think you have the wrong room. My name is Margaret, not Maggie. Forever yours, James. Margaret dropped the letter. The memory came back not like a wave, but like a dam breaking, sudden, violent, complete. She was in a hospital bed, her head wrapped in bandages, and her mother was there saying, "You had meningitis, sweetheart. You're lucky to be alive. The doctors said you might not remember everything for a while." James, Margaret had said. I need to call James. Who's James? Her mother had asked, and Margaret had opened her mouth to answer and found nothing there. She'd forgotten him. Not slowly, not piece by piece, but all at once, as if he'd been erased from her mind as cleanly as chalk from a board. Later, weeks, months, a young man had shown up at her door. Tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes the color of rain. He'd looked at her with such desperate hope that it had frightened her. "Maggie," he'd said. "My name is Margaret," she'd corrected him. "I'm sorry, but I don't know you." She'd watched him break right there in her doorway, watched him crack like glass, and she'd felt nothing but confused pity for this stranger who seemed to know her. "The letters," he'd said. "You wrote me letters. You said you loved me." "You said, I think you should go," she'd said, because she was scared and confused, and this man was a stranger, and strangers weren't supposed to look at you like you'd murdered their future. He'd left. She'd closed the door. She'd forgotten about him within the hour, and now, 60 years later, Margaret Chen remembered everything. "Oh, God," she whispered. "Oh, God, what did I do?" "Mom?" Susan's voice came from very far away. Margaret looked up at her daughter with tears streaming down her face. "I forgot him. He asked me to marry him and I said yes, and then I forgot him." "But you married him anyway," Susan said gently. "Mom, you married Dad. James. However it happened, you found your way back to each other." "Did I?" Margaret's voice was hollow. "Or did he spend 50 years married to someone who didn't remember falling in love with him?" The 5th letter came the next day. Margaret read it with Susan beside her, both of them crying before they reached the end. "My dearest Margaret, I left Stanford that day and didn't look back. I told myself I'd forget you, that I'd move on, that the universe was trying to tell me we weren't meant to be. I joined the Navy, spent 4 years on a ship trying to outrun your memory. It didn't work. I came back to San Francisco in 1972, got my engineering degree on the GI Bill. Met a woman named Sarah who was kind and smart and who I liked very much. I married her in 1974. I loved Sarah. Not the way I loved you, but truly and deeply nonetheless. She knew about you. I told her on our 3rd date that I'd been in love once and lost it. She said everyone had a first love. She said it didn't matter. We had a good marriage, 38 years, 2 kids, a house in Oakland. She died in 2012. Cancer. I thought that was the end of my love story. And then, 2 years later, I saw you at the grocery store. You were reading the label on a can of soup, concentrating hard, and I knew. I knew before you looked up, before I saw your face, before anything. I knew the shape of you, the essence of you, the soul of you. You looked up and our eyes met, and for one perfect second I thought you recognized me. But then your husband, a man I'd never seen before, came up behind you and said, "There you are, Maggie. Did you find the soup?" Maggie. He called you Maggie, the name I'd given you. The name you'd told me to call you that day on the pier in the rain. I stood there in the grocery store and watched you smile at this man, watched you take his arm, watched you walk away. And I understood. You'd come back to San Francisco. You'd married someone else. But somewhere, somehow, you'd remembered enough to take back the name I'd given you. I followed you. I'm not proud of it, but I did. I learned your husband's name, Howard Chen. Chen, my last name. I went home and dug out the box of letters, read them all. Found the one where you'd written, "When we get married, I'll be Margaret Chen." It sounds perfect, doesn't it? Like I was always meant to be yours. And then I understood everything. Forever yours, James Howard Chen. The world tilted sideways. Susan made a sound like she'd been punched. Margaret stared at the signature, at the name she'd said 10,000 times over 50 years. Howard Chen. James Howard Chen. "He came back," Margaret whispered. "He found me and he came back." "He never told you," Susan said, her voice breaking. "He married you and he never told you who he really was." The memories were coming faster now, clearer. A graduate school mixer in 1970, a tall man with rain-colored eyes approaching her. "Hi, I'm Howard Chen." The way his voice had caught on his own name, like it didn't quite fit him. "Do I know you?" she'd asked, because something about him felt familiar in a way she couldn't name. "No," he'd said, "but I'd like you to." He'd courted her carefully, patiently. He'd taken her to the pier to watch the rain. He'd found every carousel in Northern California and ridden them with her, asking each time if she remembered something, anything. She never did. And he'd married her anyway. He'd spent 50 years loving her, knowing she didn't remember falling in love with him the first time. He'd built a new story with her, a new life, and he'd never, not once, told her the truth. "Why?" Margaret's voice broke. "Why didn't he tell me?" "Maybe," Susan said slowly, "he loved you too much to make you feel guilty for something you couldn't help." Margaret thought of her husband, Howard James, the man who'd been both, and the thousands of small kindnesses he'd shown her over their decades together. The way he'd always called her Maggie, the way he'd taken her to carousels and piers and places that meant something to a past she couldn't access. The way he'd held her hand through her diagnosis and whispered, "It's okay if you forget me, Maggie. I'll remember for both of us." He'd known. He'd known what was coming because he'd lived through it before, and he'd loved her anyway. Again. "There's one more letter," Susan said, pointing to the coffee table where another cream-colored envelope sat. Margaret hadn't even noticed it arrive. With shaking hands, she opened it. "My dearest Margaret, I'm dying. The doctors say I have maybe 3 months. Lung cancer, though I never smoked. The universe's last joke, I suppose. I've spent these weeks reading your letters, the ones you wrote me 60 years ago, and I realized something. You made me promise to remember. So I am. I'm keeping your promise for you, Maggie. These letters I've sent you are copies of the ones you wrote me, your words, your memories, your love story. I've added my parts, the things you couldn't know because you weren't there, but the heart of them is yours. I don't know if they'll help you remember. The doctors said your Alzheimer's will only get worse. Soon you might not recognize Susan. Soon you might not recognize yourself. But maybe, just maybe, some part of you will hold on to this, some deep, secret place where the truth lives. You loved me once, Margaret Lee. You promised to marry me. And you did. Twice. Once when you were 18 and full of promises, and once when you were 23 and didn't know me at all. I've loved you both times. I'll love you until my last breath. And if there's anything after, if there's any truth to the promises we made, I'll love you there too. I've arranged for these letters to be sent to you after I'm gone. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you in person. I'm sorry for so many things. But mostly, I'm sorry I had to die before you could remember loving me. But maybe that's okay. Maybe it's enough that I remembered for both of us. The carousel still runs at Riverside Fair, by the way. They restored it in 2010. The horse with the green saddle and golden bridle is still there. Ride it for me, Maggie. Ride it, and remember that once, a long time ago, a boy loved you enough to build you a whole new life. Forever yours, in this life and whatever comes next, your James P.S. Check the bottom drawer of my desk. I left something for you. They found it that evening, a wooden box tied with a faded blue ribbon. Inside were 68 letters in Margaret's young handwriting, each one beginning with, "My dearest James," and ending with, I love you. I'm coming home. Wait for me. Beneath them, a photograph. A young woman in a yellow dress sitting on a carousel horse, laughing, and beside her, a young man with rain-colored eyes looking at her like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. On the back, in her handwriting, James and Maggie, Riverside Fair, the day everything changed, August 1967. And beneath that, in his handwriting added years later, the day I asked, the day you said yes, the day I knew I'd love you forever, even if you forgot. Margaret held the photograph and wept for a love story she'd lived twice and remembered once, for a man who'd loved her enough to let her forget, and for the decades they'd had together, even though she hadn't known they were a second chance. "Mom," Susan said softly, "do you want to go to Riverside Fair?" Margaret looked up, tears streaming down her face, and nodded. The carousel was just as she remembered, or rather just as she had forgotten and now remembered again. The horses gleamed under strings of lights, their painted manes frozen mid-gallop, their glass eyes reflecting a world of perpetual summer. Margaret stood at the edge, Susan's hand firm in hers, and looked for a horse with a green saddle and golden bridle. She found it. With Susan's help, she climbed on, her 78-year-old body protesting movements that had once been effortless. The calliope wheezed to life, and the carousel began to turn. And as it spun, Margaret closed her eyes, and she was 18 again, and James, her Howard, her twice-given love, was beside her, and he was asking her to marry him, and she was saying yes, 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 forever yes. The music played, the world turned, and Margaret Chen rode the carousel and remembered everything, the love she'd lost, the love she'd found again, and the man who'd loved her enough to rebuild their story from memory and hope. When the ride ended and Susan helped her down, Margaret's mind was already starting to fog again, the memories slipping away like water through her fingers. But as they walked back to the car, Margaret stopped and looked back at the carousel one last time. "I loved him," she said suddenly, clearly, as if the thought had just occurred to her. "I don't remember his name, but I loved him very much." "I know, Mom," Susan said, crying. "He loved you too." "Did he?" "Yes, twice. He loved you twice." Margaret smiled, content with this, even though she didn't quite understand it. And that night, when the fog rolled in complete and she forgot the carousel and the letters and even her daughter's name, some deep part of her, some secret, sacred place beyond memory, held on to a single truth. She had been loved. She was still loved. She would always be loved. And that was enough. 6 months later, Margaret Chen passed away peacefully in her sleep. Among her belongings, Susan found a cream-colored envelope she'd never seen before, sealed and addressed simply, "For Maggie, when you get here." Susan never opened it. Some love stories were meant to be private, but she did request that it be buried with her mother, tucked into her hands, so that if there was anything after, if there was any truth to promises made across lifetimes, her mother would have it when she found James again. And if there was a place beyond memory, beyond forgetting, where two souls who'd loved each other twice could finally remember everything, well, that would be enough. If you made it this far, don't forget to leave your comment, your like, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new stories. Thanks for watching and see you soon.